Energy. The shift from the old economy to the new is quite beautifully illustrated by Genex Power's plans to build a 150 megawatt solar PV project in the old Kidston gold mine in Queensland, next to a proposed 330 megawatt pumped hydro storage project. It's a lot of numbers. As the show that likes to shine the light, pun intended in this case, on innovation in Australia, we've invited the Executive Director of Genex, Simon Kidston, onto the program. Simon, thanks for joining us. I want to deal with the issue of your name because this perplexed me for a long time when doing research. The name, your last name, the name of this now abandoned or finished up gold mine is the same, but you didn't actually have a financial stake. Well, not a current family stake in that gold mine. Explain this to us.
That is correct. My great-great-grandfather was the Premier of Queensland when they discovered gold at the site that's now called Kidston. So they named the site after him. We've come along 100 years later and acquired the site to develop a renewable energy generation storage business, utilising what's left behind.
It is almost a beautiful metaphor, this idea of the abandoned old gold mine being now the home for what looks to be a technologically current project to try and change the shift of energy needs or energy production in Australia. But your particular project, it's these two parts. The one we're most interested in at the moment, I guess, is the solar part of this, partly because you've signed someone up to effectively go out there and get funding. But talk us through how this project came to be.
Okay, so we were looking for an innovative way to build a low-cost generation asset, and we determined that pumped storage hydro is a very efficient way to store power and also generate power. And by utilising an existing site with two very large voids, we can develop a project which has massive capital cost savings than would be the case if we went to a greenfield site.
Okay, let's talk this through, because I think a lot of people listening may, including myself, until relatively recently, not quite understand the idea of pumped stored hydro. But effectively it works as a giant battery, is that right? And what you have in the case of an abandoned gold mine is a huge hole.
Yep,
or effectively two big holes.
In fact, it's two very big holes. So pumped storage hydro is a very mature technology. It's been around for more than 100 years with three big ones in Australia. Snowy Mountains has got one large one. But we're being innovative in using the two voids, the two pits left behind from a mining operation. And it works very simply by using water in those two pits at night time when prices are low and demand is low, using surplus power to pump the water from the lower reservoir to the upper reservoir. That power is effectively stored by virtue of water at elevation and can be used when demand increases, which is typically during the daytime hours.
So gravity is your friend in this case?
So gravity is our friend, and the deeper the pits, the better or the more efficient the program.
So it sounds though like you still need another power source in order to get the water from the low level, the lower part, up to the higher part during nighttime hours, as you say, when power is cheaper. So that's still done by base load fossil fuels?
So look, I guess if we're pumping at night time, we're going to use baseload power, which is very plentiful during the night time. However, during the daytime, we're co-developing our solar project, and we can use the power from the solar project to do intraday pumping, to pump the water to the upper reservoir for discharge in the evening when the sun's no longer shining.
Okay, and so talk us through which one of these comes first. Do we get to the solar or do we go to the storage first?
Okay, so the solar project is our first project. That's now got a full completed feasibility. The approvals are completed. It's fully permitted and it's now ready to go from a project development perspective. We're just now finalising the funding arrangements to enable us to commence construction in Q4 of this calendar year.
So what was your background to come into this? Or explain to us the history of the company. Who decided that this was probably a project that could work, that the technology had advanced to a stage where you thought there is a business model in this?
So there's three founders. Michael Addison is an engineer. I've got a finance background, and our other colleague has got a finance background. The three of us were looking for a very low-cost way to generate renewable energy and energy storage. And I guess the combination of those skills and experience and perspectives came up with this idea of using this mature technology for a low-cost development.
Well, we're looking at some vision now on the screen, which is, I guess, showing Australia's kind of grid, electricity grid, and part of the problem for a lot of these energy projects is that you lose a lot of the energy when it's then being transmitted back to where people are actually using it.
Yep.
Is there a particular reason why your site, besides just having two giant holes, was particularly good as far as building the energy, the solar plant?
In terms of the solar project, it's got, I think, the best solar resource of any solar project in the country, and the reason for that is driven by its location. The further north, the further west, the better the solar resource. But the key limiting factor for many projects is access to existing transmission lines and substation. And when they built this mine in the 1980s, they built a substation and a transmission line from the coast to the mine. So we're going to utilise that existing infrastructure to fast-track the first stage of our solar development, which is 50 megawatts, with construction commencing at the end of this calendar year.
We're looking at some of the pictures of how huge these holes are as well. But how quickly do you think, realistically, these projects can be up and running?
So the first project being the solar project, we expect to generate first revenue by the end of next year, so that's the fourth quarter of 2017. The larger project being the pump storage hydro project and the expansion of solar will come on stream in 2019.
Now, it's an interesting space. I spoke in my introduction to the program. You know, the government is very focused on innovation. It starts especially since Malcolm Turnbull came to the power. But one of the other industries that's been most affected by the change in Prime Minister has been the renewable energy system. We know that the previous Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, was in favour of getting rid of a large part of the renewable program as they currently sat. How does that affect a company like yours, which at least in part I would think would at least rely on at least the ecosystem working, if not direct funding? Yeah,
so when we formed the company, it was a very challenging environment to launch a renewable energy generation company, but we anticipated change, and since there was bipartisan support for the renewable energy target, which gives certainty out to the year 2030, we've seen an enormous inflow of capital into the sector. So we've seen capital from foreign groups, domestic groups looking to develop renewable projects in Australia. Now we've got a certain regime or political regime.
So do you rely on any subsidies? Does the cost of producing the power in your setup with solar and using the storage as a kind of giant battery, does that actually compete with fossil fuels at this point, or does it still rely upon either a price on carbon or some sort of subsidy to make sure that you're effectively able to compete?
Yep. All renewable projects, whether they're wind or solar, do rely on a price on carbon in the form of the renewable energy target, which has certificates. Those certificates are now very valuable because there is certainty for that program out to 2030. So solar projects are now very fundable in the current regime and in the current environment. And that's why we're seeing a lot of development in that space.
Now, when you came to choosing technology, you're not a manufacturer of solar panels, as it were. You're not there actually creating the technology, but you are choosing the mix, I guess, of how to get that power source and how to use it. How are you going about it, and how have you found the Australian? We keep hearing that Australia is supposed to be innovative in this space. We're supposed to be doing a lot of good things, even when it comes to solar panels. Where are you sourcing the technology from?
In terms of the panels and the inverters, that's coming from overseas. We're seeing some very, very good pricing from overseas. There's been...
Is this the Chinese still competing, or is it Germany?
Chinese, North Americans and Europeans are now rapidly expanding their manufacturing to meet an expansion of global demand. So we're going to benefit from that in terms of lower capital costs, more efficient panels. But what we're also seeing is some very good Australian smarts in terms of constructing these solar projects in a very efficient and cheap way. And we're working with some groups now that we believe are leaders in the field of developing renewable energy projects.
I mean, effectively, you're kind of a giant startup, I guess. I'm interested about how hard you found it to get capital. I know you're going through a system now. Are you going through your own funding round now? But how did you find the initial going to markets? Was there an appetite to get involved here, or was that uncertainty quite hard to overcome when it came to the renewable industry? Were people worried about potentially buying into something that might be knocked on the head?
Look, we presented to some investors what we think was an innovative and smart way to build a project at a fraction of the cost it would otherwise cost to build. And I think
that's because of the fact that you were able to utilise that mine resource and
utilising existing infrastructure, developing a low-cost project, having some approvals in place which enable us to fast-track that development, did find some appeal with investors. We've now managed to firm up those plans in terms of doing bankable feasibility studies that have demonstrated, I guess, the faith we had at the start, which is now we're turning into reality.
So with startups, I'm always very interested in the start. Where was the genesis of the idea, how you put it in action, but then also what's your plan once it's in operation? Do you see this as you wanted to do the early stages and then potentially sell it off to one of the major energy producers? Is that the best way forward and then move on to another project? Or do you see yourselves as being kind of the management team in there for a while?
So we're very focused on delivering these projects. It's likely that we'll bring in a partner to fund part of the construction of the hydro project because it is a significant project. But I think the hydro project and the solar project would be seen as strategic by many of the major Australian companies and international groups. So we would hope they could join us on that journey down the track to deliver these projects.
Fascinating time. Thank you so much for joining us here on Business IQ.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Now, we are going to, fascinating story, isn't it? About using an old gold mine for Australia's new energy needs. And we are going to take a short break. But when we come back, we've got some people trying to drive Sydney back up the global rankings and make sure that we remain an attractive startup hub. Stay with us.